This is the Voice of Russia. I'm Tim Ecott. The shooting down of a high-altitude U-2 spy plane on May Day 1960 was one of the most famous incidents of the entire Cold War. Piloted by Gary Powers, the U-2 was an experimental design which could fly higher than anything the Soviet Union could put into the air against it. On that fateful day in 1960, it was attempting to photograph suspected intercontinental ballistic missile launch sites at Sverdlovsk and Plesetsk on behalf of the CIA. But it was brought down by a Dvina rocket, and the wreckage of the plane and the pilot was soon put on show in Moscow. The U-2 incident was not just an international embarrassment to the USA. The refusal of President Eisenhower to apologize, either in private or in public, caused a massive rift with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, and indirectly led to the collapse of a four-party summit involving Britain, France, the USA, and of course Russia. Joining me now is British author Giles Whittell. In his latest book, he writes about the U-2 incident and has analysed what happened afterwards. Gary Powers was imprisoned in Russia for almost 2 years and then exchanged for the Russian spy Rudolf Abel, who'd been imprisoned in the USA for espionage in 1957. The two men were exchanged on the Glinica Bridge, connecting Potsdam to West Berlin. Giles Whittell's book is called Bridge of Spies and begins with the exchange of Powers and Abel. Giles, let me ask you first of all, why do you think this meeting on the bridge between these spies and their masters was so significant?
It was the first of its kind on a misty morning just outside Berlin, with all the atmospheric tropes that became standard issue, if you like, for the Cold War. And it was the location, the Glinica Bridge, for dozens of spy swaps that followed it, and the setting for Le Carré's fictional spy swaps. So it was the one that set the scene for the next 30 years.
And the two principal people who exchanged, Gary Powers, the U-2 pilot, and Rudolf Abel, who was spying for the Soviet Union in America, both quite prominent figures as far as the media. This wasn't a under-the-covers exchange, was it? These were both people who'd been written about widely.
Oh, absolutely. They tried to keep it subject of a media blackout on the day, but there'd been speculation that there would be a swap involving these two and whoever else might be thrown into the mix ever since Powers had been shot down. And from the moment of Powers' shoot down on May 1st, 1960, his father had led the charge for a swap between Abel and Powers. It was a swap that the media knew would make a great story, and it was the New York newspapers that picked it up initially and promoted it as a great idea. There was then, of course, the question for the political principals on each side to decide whether they were equivalent in any way. And that's part of the story. They were very, very different sorts of spies.
Tell me a little bit about Rudolf Abel. I mean, you go into a lot of detail about some of the former Soviet Union spies working in America after the Second World War. A lot of them, what we would call sleepers, who you didn't really know what they did, and a lot of them didn't really do much. But what did Abel really accomplish as a spy?
That's a really good question. One of the most tantalizing moments in the research that I did for the book was a brief interview in Moscow with one of his former handlers, who I think I can name as former KGB General Yuri Drozdov, who, as far as I'm aware, is still going strong in the private sector in Moscow. I put it to Drozdov that, in fact, he recruited nobody of significance, uncovered nothing of significance, and was therefore the model of the ineffective sleeper. He said, well, of course, that's not true. He recruited very useful assets for Soviet intelligence, but even now, I'm not going to tell you who they were, and to expect me to do so would be ridiculous. It was extremely difficult to gather intelligence on what really mattered: numbers of nuclear missiles, progress in nuclear weapons research in the US. I
mean, he would sort of go around America, in effect, as a tourist, wouldn't he? I mean, he went down to Cape Canaveral to watch a rocket being launched. But, I mean, as any member of the public could have done.
As any member of the public could have done, yes. I mean, the artist friend of his, whom I met and interviewed in New York, described him as a reverse Fulbright. In other words, someone touring the country, largely for his own edification, and with great natural curiosity and some resourcefulness. But access to Los Alamos? Of course not.
Now, if we go swiftly moving on to the U-2, which of course was the spy plane, no other word for it really, is there? It was designed specifically to fly higher and faster than any other plane in the world, to take photographs of military or secret installations in the Soviet Union. This was very much more concentrated scientific spying than what Rudolf Abel was actually up to in America, wasn't it?
Yeah, born of the same need to get hard information about how far along the opposite side was in building the instruments of Armageddon. And of course, if it was hard for Abel to gather real intelligence on the American nuclear program, it was even harder for any American spy who might be on the ground in Khrushchev's Russia. Hence the decision by Eisenhower's administration to get up there. I think that was the phrase that they used. Anyway, yes, 70,000 feet, 13,000 meters. Lockheed Skunk Works were, under the leadership of Kelly Johnson, were convinced that they could do it. He took what was essentially a starfighter and gave it glider's wings instead of the short, stubby ones. And they fooled around. I mean, it's a famous and extraordinary story with the design and the jet fuel for a few frantic months, and then started testing in what has become known as Area 51 in complete secrecy.
An extraordinary thing that I learnt from the book, I'd always assumed that Gary Powers, who became notorious stroke famous for being shot down in the Soviet Union, I'd always assumed he was a military pilot. Well, he was trained as a military pilot, but in fact he'd had to resign and was technically a civilian when he made those overflights.
Yes. They were assured when offered the CIA secondment that they would be allowed back into the Air Force, but it was absolutely crucial for what Eisenhower regarded as the legitimacy of the scheme that they not be military pilots. That would have been, Eisenhower understood, a provocation too far to send military pilots over the heart of the Soviet Union. But this was all part of what turned out to be inadequate contingency planning for if their cover was ever blown. They were going to say that these were weather reconnaissance flights. And
in fact, all of the aviators and avionics experts were convinced that if there was a technical problem or Soviet Union managed to shoot down a U-2, there was virtually no chance that a pilot would survive.
That's right. In the early flights over Central Europe, one of the U-2s, and they were very fragile, simply broke up and the pilot died while descending over East Germany to a landing, I think it was in Poland, because two Canadian Sabre jets, curious as to what this plane was, had no markings, flew up alongside, and in the turbulence the plane simply broke up and the pilot died.
Just to go back briefly to the political atmosphere at the time, you mentioned that Rudolf Abel, the Soviet spy, was already in prison. This was, of course, after the Soviet Union took over what became East Germany and built the Berlin Wall. So tensions were high. This was what we now refer to as the Cold War. But it seemed as if Khrushchev and Eisenhower, from your book, had a sort of understanding. There was a certain level of mutual respect between them, and Eisenhower seems to have been very reluctant to even pursue the U-2 program. He was quite nervous of the diplomatic fallout that would result from what, in fact, eventually happened.
Intensely nervous, and as a result, for most of the 3 years before the shoot-down in 1960, whenever Richard Bissell, running the U-2 program within the CIA, had come to him or come to his close advisors asking for clearance for an overflight, it had been turned down. There had been hardly any in 58 and 59. Moreover, of course, you had Khrushchev's famous visit to the US in the late summer of 59, which all unfolded slightly against Eisenhower's expectations, but nonetheless produced a return. Here was the Soviet leader cracking jokes all over the US, and it produced this invitation for Eisenhower and family to pay a return visit to the Soviet Union in the spring of 1960, for which Khrushchev planned an Eisenhower dacha on the cliff overlooking Lake Baikal, the Soviet Union's first ever golf course. And this is the hard evidence for the start of an unlikely détente between them, which of course was destroyed by the overflight. And Eisenhower seems to have been led somewhat reluctantly into that warming of the personal relationship with a man who he found very difficult to fathom. But nonetheless, it's well known that, of course, he was also extremely reluctant to encourage the rocket builders on his side. And his famous farewell speech warning the world about the military-industrial complex showed that he was very clearly in favor of détente in principle if it could be achieved.
And yet the military administration, or what we would now call the hawks in the administration, were telling Eisenhower and fueling this frenzy of speculation that the Soviet Union was building ballistic missiles that, like sausages in a sausage factory, that they had potentially thousands of these weapons which could target the USA. And in fact, you demonstrate in the book that this was in fact nonsense, that Russia was quite poorly armed.
Yes, it was nonsense. You had 16 competing US intelligence agencies, one of which in particular, the Air Force Intelligence Agency, regarded it as its responsibility to deal only in worst-case scenarios. And they were also keen to promote a missile-building agenda. Long story short, early 1960, they are saying that if the Soviet Union does not already have hundreds of ICBMs, they will within months. Khrushchev hadn't helped by boasting in a public speech that he was going to produce them like sausages. Nonetheless, it's clear now that the number of operational long-range ballistic missiles at that time was at a maximum 4.
I mean, this is all eerily prescient and reminiscent of the search for the weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East, isn't it?
Yeah, you're telling me. And the vested interests involved in exaggerating the threat from the other side are very clear. If you look at the business position of the main American missile builders at the beginning of 1960, when there were no major contracts, and the end of 1961, by which time Convair, the maker of Atlas, had been contracted to produce several hundred, you can see why respectable historians over the ensuing decades have looked very carefully at the record to satisfy themselves that there wasn't some kind of plan to ensure that détente was destroyed before it got going.
That's a pretty shocking scenario.
I think you can't avoid the conclusion that there was a real opportunity in the spring of 1960 with the Paris summit looming and Eisenhower's instincts to restrict military spending on his side and Khrushchev's need to find an alternative to breakneck military spending and Macmillan's instincts to look for peace where it could be found. You can't avoid the conclusion that a real opportunity for détente was missed, if not deliberately destroyed then, and it wouldn't come around again for another generation.
Now let's get to the nub of the story, which of course is that Gary Powers took off from Turkey and went on this flight looking for photographic evidence, or his mission was to fly the plane and take photographs of what people in the States assumed was this missile base. He was brought down. I mean, the Russians, the Soviet Union at the time, didn't have fantastic technology in terms of what could be launched against a U-2. That was its beauty as a device, wasn't it? That no one could reach it. But some extraordinary circumstances came together to allow the Soviet Union to bring it down. Tell me what exactly happened.
Right. Well, first of all, he did take off from Turkey, but his initial destination was Peshawar in northwestern Pakistan, because it had been decided that gave him a better chance of deep penetration over his targets, which were what was then known as Tyuratam, now Baikonur, and beyond that Sverdlovsk, now Yekaterinburg, and beyond that Plesetsk. In April 1960, the CIA was optimistic that he could get clear across Russia without being brought down, because the radar net over Soviet Central Asia was weaker than over, for example, the East European front. because fighter jets simply couldn't get that high, even in what they call a zoom climb, where they descend before climbing as far as they can, and because the best anti-aircraft missiles that they had, the Dvina, had not proved itself until that point at 70,000 feet, 13,000 meters. He took off from Peshawar in the morning of May the 1st. The fact that this was a holiday with most aviation grounded in the Soviet Union hadn't deterred the mission planners. You can look at that two ways. Either that it was an outrageous provocation, even more than the previous
any
flight.
flight overflying would be much more easily spotted on radar because there was so little in the air.
Right, and that it was an important socialist holiday, or you could look at the same circumstances and say, well, then let's fly it now when there's nothing in the air. He was picked up immediately by Soviet radar as he entered Soviet airspace, flying north from Peshawar. He was followed about 20,000 feet below his own altitude by fighters as he proceeded north over the desert towards Baikonur, the cosmodrome. And then his own autopilot went wrong as he approached Sverdlovsk, and he had to take the decision to continue flying, but flying manually, which is extremely arduous.
And these were very long missions that these pilots were flying. I mean, what, 8, 9, 10 hours they were having to go.
Right, with no nourishment and no lavatories. But he decided to continue. He was picked up and they had no reason for confidence that they would bring him down. They'd never tried it before. But nonetheless, I went and interviewed the commander of the battalion that did bring him down, and he now lives in retirement on the shore of the Black Sea. And he described very vividly the appearance of the plane as a green dot on his screen, the decision to fire, the order, in fact, to fire from the commanding officer for the whole ring of rocket battalions, and the sight of, from within the command cabin, the missile closing on the green dot, and a sort of explosion of chaff on the screen, which was matched by the sight that the soldiers themselves saw outside, largely silent because it was all happening so high up, of an explosion and then eventually a parachute.
And that became a media frenzy, didn't it? I mean, an international furore. Powers parachuted down, immediately picked up, the plane recovered, put on public display. I mean, it couldn't have been a worse propaganda disaster for Eisenhower.
Exactly, especially since Eisenhower's chief political asset on the international stage was supposed to be his trustworthiness. He had persisted with the fiction that America didn't spy, even after reports came through that the plane was down. He'd authorized the release of the cover story that this was a weather flight gone wrong. And then, famously, Khrushchev appeared in public in Moscow and said, "We have the pilot alive and kicking." And I think diplomatically, it was that humiliation that hardened Eisenhower. He was so infuriated by the whole episode, which he described in his autobiography as the worst political experience of his life, that he thought, the hell with it. I'm not going to do the one thing that Khrushchev wants, which is to apologize. I'm not going to do it in public. When he had many opportunities to do it in private before the Paris summit later that year, he refused then as well. And we will never know whether that would have been enough for Khrushchev to put all his extravagant arms reduction offers back on the table. But
so the shooting down of the U-2 and the refusal of Eisenhower to apologize, and the hard evidence that America had not been telling the truth about what it was up to, was a key fuel, if you like, for the escalation of the Cold War.
Absolutely. It was the reason that the Paris summit midway through May 1960 ended in total failure. And Khrushchev was left to return to Moscow to begin, not to continue, a massive Soviet arms build-up. At that point, he felt he had no option
Let's turn to Gary Powers himself, the hapless pilot, if you like. I mean, you describe him as a farm boy, grew up in the Midwest, failed to become a doctor, entered the Air Force because it was a good job, but he was a sort of outdoors type who the life of the pilot seemed to suit. But extraordinary circumstances resulted in him joining this U-2 brigade, this secret service, and then suddenly he finds himself the center of this international diplomatic firestorm once he's shot down and held captive in Moscow.
Right. He was given little credit after the whole scandal blew up for his flying, but and indeed he was criticized as a blabbermouth who'd spilled his guts to save his own skin in his trial in Moscow. But the courage that it took to sit in one of these planes and fly, as you say, for 9 hours across the most closely guarded secret installations in the world was considerable. And he did that without any hesitation. It was an opportunity that he welcomed. He'd wanted to prove himself in the Korean War in fighter jets at that time, and he was a little bit too young. He did not commit suicide, either in the cockpit, on his way down, or on being detained, and a lot of his superiors in the CIA criticized him for not having done that.
And he was given a suicide pill, wasn't he? There was some sort of device he carried in his flight suit, which the Soviet authorities made much play of.
Yes, it was a pin hidden in a coin, which he was supposed to jab into his leg, except that he wasn't. I mean, it's very clear that they were not given orders to commit suicide if they were taken. On the contrary, they had standing orders to try to escape. This was, they had been told, a pin that they could use if they were being tortured and that became unbearable. And it was a choice between dying and giving away important secrets, or just dying quickly.
But the Soviet authorities or military supposedly tested this device, didn't they?
Yes, it was taken off him, I believe, on his arrival in Moscow on the day of the evening of the day of the shoot down, and as it was taken off him, Powers said, "Be careful with that; it's lethal." And they went away and tested it on a dog, and the dog died.
Now, we'll skip over the details of the trial. They're sort of historically on record, but there was the real possibility that he might have been executed as a spy in the Soviet Union, wasn't there?
He certainly thought so, and yes, that option was open to the court and ultimately to Khrushchev. There's no doubt, though, that Powers was much more useful to the regime as a bargaining chip. What was interesting was that between the shoot-down and the trial, Kennedy had won an election and was much less inclined to trade Powers for anyone than his predecessor, because Kennedy was one of the group who believed that Powers had let himself and his country down.
And you allude in your book, Bridge of Spies, to the fact that change of administration in the United States was also crucial to both how Powers was regarded and treated after his release, but also to that relationship with Khrushchev and to the escalation of the United States' feelings about how the Soviet Union should be treated. Yes.
Kennedy's first summit with Khrushchev in Vienna was a power play, 1-0 to the Soviet Union, if you like, and leading quite swiftly to the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's hard to imagine if Eisenhower's planned visit in the spring of 1960 had taken place, if talks had got underway about large-scale conventional nuclear arms reductions. If any of that had happened, it's hard to imagine a flotilla of Soviet ships heading towards Cuba and installing missiles there. The Powers episode is well known as a turning point in the Cold War, but I think people forget just how very different the world could have been had that mission turned out differently.
And had Eisenhower been able to play golf in Moscow?
Had Eisenhower been able to play golf in Moscow, had he been able to support Nixon's presidential campaign with a plausible account of expert management of the superpower relationship, we could very well have had Nixon instead of Kennedy as president. Remember that Kennedy won by the smallest margin of any president to that date. Everything changed.
And let's return to Gary Powers, whose name became famous because of this ill-fated mission. What happened to him on his return to the United States? There was certainly a degree to which he was vilified or ignored or suspected of having not done the honourable thing in military terms. It was certainly he'd failed by allowing himself to be shot down. That was the attitude of a lot of people, wasn't it?
Indeed. Publicly he was exonerated. He was given the chance to explain himself in front of a special Senate committee and the press, and he gave his account of the shoot-down, which he then wrote up and which has since been largely accepted. Privately, John McCone, the then Director of Central Intelligence, never believed him and ensured that he would not remain for long as a CIA employee. He was taken on largely out of charity by his old colleagues at Lockheed, where he did some more test flying for Kelly Johnson and the Skunk Works Design Bureau in California. But then Johnson called him in and said, "Gary, I'm sorry, the money for your salary has run out," at which point it became clear to Powers that the money had always been from the CIA. And he then, looking around for a livelihood, started flying a traffic and weather news helicopter for the NBC affiliate in LA, and in 1977 was flying down the coast from Santa Barbara towards Van Nuys Airport in the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles, and he'd been covering a forest fire, and he ran out of fuel and crashed. What has sustained conspiracy theories there is that you wouldn't expect a pilot of his experience to run out of fuel and crash. Well, the truth seems to be that he knew that the fuel gauge on his helicopter was faulty. He had reported it faulty. It had been fixed. He hadn't been told that it had been fixed. That in itself has kept the conspiracy theorists guessing. A fellow spy plane pilot who flew both the U-2 and the SR-71, whom I spoke to and who was a close friend of Powers, came down from Northern California to ask around himself and investigate, and concluded that there was no foul play, and he just described it to me as a hell of a way to go.
Why do these events and the Cold War in general, why do they continue to fascinate authors and readers? It seems to be enjoying a resurgence right now. There's a renewed fascination with Le Carré's work and other spy novels, and there's even a new generation of novelists and authors looking at the Cold War. Why do you think that is?
The Cold War has a very particular fascination, I think, for those who lived it and for those who now consider it merely as an historical subject. But the Cold War that I grew up with was the sort of 20, 30-year period of terrifying tension, with the occasional release with films like Dr. Strangelove, that began, to all intents and purposes, with the Powers shoot-down.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia. I'm Tim Ecott, and I've been in conversation with the author Giles Whittell about his book entitled Bridge of Spies. It's available in paperback now, published by Simon & Schuster.